Page 253 of The Unfolding is the story of Phillis Dewitt.
God has used every single trauma in my life for good. It doesn't mean it wasn't painful. It doesn't mean it's not still painful on days. But God is using it for good. And for that, I feel blessed.
God's story has been unfolding.
Since the beginning of time.
He invites you to be a part of it.
Another page in The Unfolding.
Hi, this is Meredith Foster. Before we begin, a quick content warning. This episode includes discussion of childhood sexual abuse, self-harm, and trauma. It may not be suitable for young listeners. What if the very things that tried to destroy you became the things God used to shape your purpose? Phillis Dewitt grew up in the shadow of abuse, rejection, and trauma. From her earliest years, she faced things no child should ever endure: violence in her home, sexual abuse by family members, and the crushing belief that she was unwanted. By the time she was a teenager, Phillis was self-harming, suicidal, and desperately searching for a place to belong. But that is not where her story ends. Through a long and painful journey, Phillis found faith, healing, and purpose. Together with her husband, she would foster more than 100 children, become a voice for survivors of abuse, and live out her calling to show God's unconditional love to the most vulnerable. Her story is proof of this. Trauma doesn't have to define you, and God can bring beauty out of the darkest places.
I grew up here in the Midwest in a home where neither of my parents had attended any of high school. So they had both come from the hills of Tennessee, and they both only went through the 8th grade. Unfortunately, I think both of my parents came from very wounded backgrounds, and they brought their wounds into the marriage. Mm-hmm. And so I grew up in a very abusive home, a lot of fighting, a lot of arguing, a lot of name calling, a lot of struggles that unfortunately impacted me from a very early age. My mom had my brother, and then was told back in those years that if you were breastfeeding, you couldn't get pregnant. And so she was exclusively breastfeeding my brother and got pregnant with me and was devastated. Told me from a very young age that she had tried to abort me and had tried to jump off the back porch to have just a natural miscarriage.
She shared that with you openly?
Mm-hmm, yes.
Wow.
And so I grew up not really feeling wanted and not really feeling loved. And I also had what's called strabismus, or crossed eyes. So I had glasses from the time I was 11 months old, just to try to bring my eyes from being crossed to a more normal position. And I think that impacted my self-esteem as well.
Sure.
Having thick glasses, knowing that your parents weren't wanting you. So just lots and lots of struggles in those early years. But what was kind of exciting is we lived in this small house, and if you walked out our back door and out the gate and down the alley, about a half a block away was a church, a small Baptist church on the corner. When I was about 8 years old, my brother and I were attending that church. We would go there on Sundays by ourselves, without our parents. And I think part of it was just to get away from some of the turmoil that would be going on in our home on the weekend. That's where I learned about Jesus. And my salvation experience, quite honestly, in the beginning was more out of a fear of hell than it was really understanding that Jesus was my Savior and that Jesus died for me and that Jesus loved me. I just knew I didn't want to go to hell. So I went forward during one of those amazing stanzas of "Just as I am, without one plea," yes. And I accepted Christ as my Savior. And that began my journey of understanding, or trying to understand more about Jesus. And fortunately, our church had a small group called Awanas that I would go to on Wednesday nights. Again, it would give me another night away from home, and learned more about Jesus then. And that was kind of where I kind of transitioned from a fear of hell to this man gave his life for me and loves me and cares about me. But I think largely because of my childhood, I was very performance-based. Even in Awanas, I was very performance-based. I had to learn the most memory verses. I had to get the badges first. I had to do this first. I had to do that first. That skewed my actual understanding of Jesus somewhat, because I was always worried that if I wasn't reading the Bible, or I wasn't praying, or I wasn't doing this, or I wasn't doing that, would Jesus still love me just the way that I was. So I took that lens that I had developed in early childhood into my relationship with Christ. So those early years, I remember that my relationship with Christ was also very performance-based, and I wasn't super secure in knowing that he loved me just the way that I was.
Was that true at home with your, like, say, with your mom? Did you find yourself trying to do things to please, to get approval, or was that even possible with your parents?
It was mostly outside the home, quite honestly, like in school. I was a straight A student. It wasn't good enough for me to get an A. I wanted to get the best A. I wanted to get the fastest A. I wanted to get the earliest A. It wasn't because I wanted to show people how smart I was. It was in my head, me doing that was just putting me on a level playing field with everybody else. It wasn't putting me above anybody else. It was making me an okay human being.
Wow.
And so, it was, I took it was mostly outside of the home. I knew there was nothing I was going to do that was going to please my father. There were things that I could do that did please my mom, and I tried to do those. But because of when the sexual abuse started, and because they were mostly her relatives, it was my grandfather, her father, it was her brother, I think there was a lot of early on anger in my life towards my mother that she couldn't see what was happening and that she wasn't protecting me. And so I don't think I spent a lot of time trying to, my performance-based wasn't geared towards her as much because I had this
all that other
underlying unexplainable anger.
And for a child that age, no way to understand that or process that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
So when did the sexual abuse begin? What was that circumstance?
So interestingly, the very first memory I ever have of sexual abuse, I was like 3 years old, and it started with my grandfather. I really couldn't even imagine that I could remember so specifically the things that happened to me at 3 years old. But so it was later, many years later, when I married, and I asked my husband to go with me to confront each of my abusers. And I did, and he went with me. My grandfather had passed away already, so I couldn't confront him. But I was able to confront others that started around that same time, and they validated very firmly that I was 3 years old when they started. And so for me, that helped me understand that my memories were accurate, that I was in that age of 3 years old. And my grandfather was my first abuser, and then an uncle and a cousin. It seemed to be a natural part of life, to a 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-old. I honestly had no shame or fear or guilt or anything attached to it because I thought every little girl in the universe was doing these exact same things in their home. Wow. I had no reference point until I first told somebody. And when I told somebody, she was in my brownie troop. And I told her, and her mother was our little brownie leader, and she told her mom, and I could tell by the look on both their faces that this wasn't normal. And that was the first day that the shame and the guilt and the fear actually attached itself to those events.
I would love to dive in a little bit to that, because shame seems to be such a big part of what takes root is so young, keeps us from telling anybody after that point. I don't know if you can share more about what that experience was like and how you were different after you realized that.
Absolutely. So again, I truly believed this was a normal part of growing up. So there were no negative anything attached to it until that day. And that day I knew I can't tell another soul. That was where the deep-seated desire that this has to be a secret came in. And then it was an embarrassment. And yet the things kept going on in my life. And now I felt guilty because now I knew it was wrong and I couldn't stop it. I'm 8 years old and 9 years old and 10 years old, and it's continuing, but now I know it's wrong and I still didn't have the tools to stop it. That's when a lot of self-harming behavior starts coming to play. And I, as a young teen, developed an eating disorder. I would also harm myself, physically harm myself on purpose. I think that was my way to try to deal with all of that shame and guilt and fear that came into my life as an 8-year-old.
Do you know if your mother knew what was going on?
So, it's a good question. I like to believe, and this is a sad part, and I've confronted her and she has said this is not accurate, but I truly believe that she was probably molested as well because of the relatives that molested me. And she was very much the youngest of the family of these brothers and her father. And so I think she had a lot of her own wounds that she just couldn't come to grips with. So I don't think she knew in the beginning, but from the time I did finally tell her, when I was 15, she decided that she just couldn't live with my dad's abuse anymore. He was so physically violent and so explosive. And there were many, many times in my childhood I thought my dad was going to kill her. I mean, it was so bad.
Wow.
And yet she didn't have a high school education. So she didn't really have a way that she felt like she could support the family. So she came to us and said, we're moving out and I'm going to live with my brother and his wife. And her brother was one of my abusers. And I told her everything. And she and I got into a huge argument. It actually turned physical. And that was when I first went into foster care. And so there was never a time that she ever told me that she believed me. And there was never a time that she ever told me that she was abused. And she's passed away now. But I truly believe that the likelihood that she was abused is very great.
So at 15, she says she's moving you in you're going to move in with the uncle who was one of your abusers. You tell her, big explosion, and you end up in foster care.
I did. That was when I ended up in foster care. So my first foster home was amazing. They were Christians. They were wonderful. They were a young married couple. They had a toddler. But I was there probably less than 2 months when my foster dad got arrested for bank embezzlement. That overwhelmed my foster mom, and here she's got a toddler, and they're a big part of the local church, and it was devastating for her. And so she had me move to a different foster home. Again, I was super excited about the second foster home because they were also strong Christians, and he was a deacon of the church. And so I thought, this is going to be amazing. This is going to be wonderful. And he actually ended up molesting me. And that was just a huge, devastating blow momentarily to my faith, not in God, but in the church. Momentarily, it just shattered me. And I actually took everything that was happening to my youth pastor, and I shared it with my youth pastor, and my youth pastor immediately said, I just don't think I can believe this. There's just no way I believe this. So my foster dad was a firefighter as well. So my youth pastor actually asked me to come to the church. He wanted me to call my foster dad at the fire station the next time that he was working, which was like 2 days from then, and he would listen in on the extension. He asked me to make sure that whatever my foster dad said, that it was clear that it was something that I didn't want. Now, to a 15 and 16-year-old, because at this point I think I was 16, that sounded reasonable. But as an adult looking back, that was so unreasonable.
Oh, my goodness.
My foster dad's in his late 30s, and I'm 16 years old. But anyway, I was able to call him, and my youth pastor was on the phone listening. And my foster dad admitted to what he was doing, said that he knew it was something that I didn't want, that he had heard me crying after he would leave my room. And so my youth pastor was absolutely convinced that what I had shared with him was true. So my youth pastor asked me to go with him to our senior pastor. I went with him into his office, and my youth pastor went on and described everything that had just transpired. And my senior pastor looked up at me and said, "You are never to step foot back in this church again." So here, the one place that I felt safe and secure and loved and cared about said, "You're gone. You can't come back."
Did he give you any explanation for that? Or was he simply saying, "I don't believe what you guys are saying"?
You know what? He never said that he didn't believe. And because my youth pastor had made it so clear what he had just heard, I think during those years, this was back in 1976. So I think back in those years, the church just was not equipped to know how to handle it. And so it was just much easier for them to sweep it under the rug and move forward as
you
if, yes,
and move on.
Yes.
Wow.
And so that's what happened. Unfortunately, I made a lot of stupid mistakes after that.
Did you stay in that home, or were you able to get out of that home?
The state of Illinois actually made me an emancipated minor at the age of 16. So here I am now, an emancipated minor by the state of Illinois. I graduated. I told you I was very performance-based, so I graduated from high school as a junior. I didn't have to go to any of my senior year at all, and was working 2 jobs. I was working at a nursing home and working at a restaurant, and the state said, "You're an emancipated minor." So to a 16-year-old, that sounds exciting for about 30 seconds. Because now you learn real quickly that nobody wants to rent an apartment to a 16-year-old, and nobody wants to give a car loan to a 16-year-old. And it's so hard to establish yourself in another church when all of a sudden you've just been so wounded. And so everything that was solid in my life was completely destroyed overnight. I was floundering. My self-harming behavior just blew up. My eating disorder blew up, and I ended up taking a whole bunch of sleeping pills and drinking a half a bottle of lime vodka and went out driving.
Oh, my goodness.
And after I got stopped on multiple traffic violations by a Mormon police officer, fortunately, the police in the area knew my family, knew my situation, knew me. So they were very kind, but they brought me back to the station. I slept in the jail cell all night. They brought me McDonald's for breakfast. I remember it clearly. And that Mormon police officer said, I've talked with the captain here at the police station, and if you will agree to see the elders of my church, there's not going to be any traffic charges against you, and we'll take you back to your apartment. And I said, bring on the elders. I'm expecting two little old men, old elders. And in the Mormon church, it wasn't two little old men. It was two Mormon missionaries. I think because I was so devastated by everything that had gone on in my life and my church, and the Mormon church at that point was so family oriented and so caring, and they were welcoming me in. There was that period in my life that I joined the Mormon church. I never lost my faith in Jesus Christ. I never lost my belief in Christianity, but I was looking for some place that would accept me, and the Mormon church accepted me. So there was a period in my life there that I joined the Mormon church, and a lot that God taught me through that was good about family, about, loving people, and about the importance of establishing my own family and establishing things that would break ties to the things that I had grown up with. And so there were even good things that the Lord used during that experience.
Okay. You've lived like 7 lifetimes by the time you're 60 years old. There's so much that has happened in this short amount of time. So you're living on your own, paying your own bills, working 2 jobs. You've graduated high school. You're in an apartment. Now you're being welcomed into this community in a Mormon church. But you have so much wreckage that you're carrying behind you.
Yes.
Did you enter into this sort of new community with the idea of, I'm just going to try to forget all of that? Were you even aware how much it was affecting you? You're so young still.
I was aware. I had already had at that point 1 or 2 psychiatric hospitalizations because of my self-harming behavior. And so I was very aware of the wreckage that had come out of my life. In fact, shortly after joining the Mormon church, I thought the best thing I can do is get away from here. So I moved to Provo, Utah. And immediately as a 16-year-old, I moved to Provo, Utah. I worked at Tippanoga's nursing home and Pizza Hut.
Was it just to get away?
It was to get away and to start new with these people that are treating me like family, which is something that I craved and wanted.
Absolutely.
And so I moved to Utah. I was there, probably 3 or 4 months, and my father committed suicide. My biological father committed suicide.
Had you kept any contact with him
or
your mom?
I probably had more contact with my mom than my dad, but before I had become an emancipated minor, so this is when I was still in my second foster home, we used to do a thing on Thursday nights called calling, and we would, just do cold calls at people's homes and invite them to accept the Lord as their Savior, or we could pray over names of people that we might want to invite to know the Lord. And so I had gone to my youth pastor, and this is before I became an emancipated minor, and asked him if he would go with me to visit my dad. My dad at that visit prayed and accepted the Lord as a Savior.
Wow.
So I'd had that experience with my dad prior to all of this. Now, I still didn't have a close relationship with my dad, but I did have that experience with my dad. So when I was in Utah, I probably hadn't spoken with him since that night that he had accepted the Lord as a Savior. He worked for Caterpillar, just absolutely never missed a day of work, ever, ever, ever. My brother gets a phone call from Caterpillar saying, your dad hasn't been there for several days. So my brother called my dad, and my dad said, well, it's because my car isn't working, and so I can't get to work. So my brother actually went over there and repaired my dad's car for him. It was the next day that my dad used that car to commit suicide, which created a lot of struggles from my brother who had repaired the car.
Sure.
But I think he knew he was a very angry, abusive man. And I think he was sad that my mom had left him, but he just didn't know how to deal with it and was, turned to suicide.
Wow.
So I came back from my dad's funeral. I came back from my dad's funeral. Honestly, didn't feel a lot of emotions that would be considered normal because he had been so abusive. But that was where I ended up meeting the man that I would later marry at my dad's funeral.
At your dad's funeral?
Yes.
Okay, tell me about that relationship.
So his name was Tony. He was 27 years old.
And you were?
At that point, I'm like almost 17 or right at 17 now.
Okay.
So he was part of the Mormon church. He was what they called the young adult leader of the Mormon church. And so he was over anybody that was out of high school but not married. He was actually told to go to the funeral because I had joined the church here locally before I moved to Utah. So he was told to go to the funeral. So he actually had been set up on a blind date, and he took this blind date to my dad's funeral. True story.
What a bizarre
circumstance. True story. And so he tells this girl, he'd never met her. One of his buddies had set him up. He said, I need to stop at the funeral first. It's kind of part of my job in the Mormon church. And so he did. And it was just, a very brief meeting, nothing, no sparks, no nothing, just a very brief meeting. He tells the story that he went to take this girl home that night. And she said, well, the guy that set us up doesn't know this, but I feel like I need to tell you that I'm actually married and I have 3 children and I'm separated from my husband, but I'm not divorced yet. None of which Tony knew, nothing. So he knew he was done with her. And his immediate thought was, well, I just met this girl at the funeral tonight. So that was literally how our relationship started.
Oh, boy. So obviously you had contact with him again after the funeral.
I did. He had gone to BYU. He was already scheduled a trip out to Utah. So I went, after the funeral, I went back to Utah. He already scheduled a trip out to Utah to visit some friends that he had out there. So we continued to date for the week and a half that he was out there. Then we dated via telephone, and back then it was all long distance. So
and it was expensive.
Insane.
Yeah.
And so then he asked me to come back here. So I came back here and we got married. Interesting part of his story was he grew up in the Baptist church, and his mom was divorced and had 5 kids, and the church in Mississippi had told them that they just really were not welcome there as a divorced mom with 5 children. And so she ended up joining the Mormon church out of that trauma in her life. And so we both had come from, a strong gospel Bible believing background, and both found ourselves in the Mormon church, needing family acceptance, love, and just a place that we felt like we belonged.
So you're married now. Are you 17?
Oh, 18? I'm 18. We got married when I was 18 and Tony was 27.
Wow.
Yeah.
How was marriage?
Very hard in the beginnings. It was interesting. I had gotten pregnant before we got married, and I lost that baby in an ectopic pregnancy. So part of the consequences in the Mormon church was that my husband got excommunicated. But because he had been on a mission, he had been through the temple, and that was just something you weren't supposed to do. So he went through what they consider a church court, and he got excommunicated. They said because I was a new member, I wasn't going to be excommunicated, but I asked to be excommunicated anyway because it just seemed fair. If he was, I was. So part of that court, in that church court, was you two need to get married. So we got married, and I loved him, but I would ask him repeatedly, do you love me? And he's like, no, but this is the right thing. So we're doing the right thing. Now, after several years of counseling, we both realized he did love me. He just didn't understand what love was, and he was afraid of a commitment and afraid of marriage. And so that made some very rough years in those beginning years.
Bet.
Very rough years. Yeah. I wanted security. he was saying, I'm following the church's ruling on what they told me I needed to do. The first 5 years were very, very difficult. And as far as just the intimacy of a marriage was very, very hard for me.
Sure.
He would say things like, what are you thinking? And I'd say, in the middle of intimacy, he would ask me that. And I would say, oh, I'm thinking about the list of the 7 things that I need to do when we're done. And he's like, what? And I'm like, I have to completely dissociate from this. And that was all going on the first 5 years as well.
Mm-hmm. Tell me about your faith during this time. Like, this is, again, such a roller coaster of events. You craving love and acceptance. Mm-hmm. Now you're in a marriage with somebody who says he doesn't love you.
Right.
Just so many things going on.
Lots and lots of hard years. But you know what? I still turn to the Lord every single day. And I was still reading my Bible. And I was still praying. And the Lord was still giving me peace. Then we had 3 children. Boom, boom, boom. We had 3 children under the age of 3.
Wow.
So I had Melanie, then I had Chris, and then I had Brandon the day before Melanie turned 3 years old. So I literally had 3 under 3. So life was busy and crazy and fun, and yet, it was hard those first few years. But we both grew. We ended up, obviously, leaving the Mormon church much later. But during those years, we both came from a solid Bible-believing background, and I think that was very sustaining for us both. Nothing about joining the Mormon church made me turn my back on Jesus Christ or God or understanding salvation. It was simply a place where they accepted me and cared about me, and I'd been kicked out of the church I'd grown up to love.
What was the impetus for leaving the Mormon church? What made you decide to do that?
We were attending the Mormon church, and there were several incidences where sex offenders were in the Mormon church, and they were actually court-recognized sex offenders. The rulings of how the Mormon church handled that was very poor, and they would allow these people to repent, come back into the church, and still be with kids, and still supervise kids, and still be in positions over kids. We actually, over several different myriads of events, we ended up taking the Mormon church to court. And they flew out, the several general authorities, and met with us, and ended up settling out of court, making commitments that they would put policies into place that would not allow that to happen anymore. So I became much more vocal and confident about making sure that people were protected and safe, and that kids were safe. And they would start off saying things like, you have to forgive. And I said, I agree, absolutely 100% agree that we have to forgive. But forgiveness does not constitute trust. It doesn't mean that we have to let them watch our children. It doesn't mean that we even have to, if I am forgiving my offender, it doesn't mean that I even have to establish a relationship with them. Right. It just means that I have to forgive them. And so getting the church leaders to understand the difference between forgiveness and trust was a huge challenge, a huge challenge. And so we flew out to Salt Lake. They flew out here. And after several meetings, they said, we'll settle out of court and we'll put these stipulations into place. We'll do this and this and this. And they did. And then we knew it was time for us to leave. And we both left and never looked back. And God has continued to use our story and my story and all of that trauma to bring about good. Everything that Satan meant to harm me, the Lord has used for good.
From the very beginning of her life, Phillis faced pain and rejection. But even in the darkest places, God was at work. Coming up, Phillis shares the moment she confronted her abusers, how God began healing the deepest wounds, and how he gave her a new sense of worth and purpose. You mentioned earlier that at one point you actually confronted your abusers.
I did.
What led to that? And maybe a broader question was, throughout this time, in your marriage, your early 20s, and as you're establishing your own family, were you sharing with people about your past?
So let me answer that, but let me go back to one other thing first so that maybe you'll get a bigger picture of where I was at times emotionally. So, I told you my father worked for Caterpillar. And so Caterpillar would give all of their employees 2 weeks off every Christmas time. So Christmases for me were wrought with a lot of memories of screaming and yelling and hiding and fighting
because he was home.
Because he was home, and I hated Christmases. So taking that into a marriage as a young mom was very, very hard for me. Inevitably, the first 5 years of our marriage at Christmas, I would end up back in the psychiatric hospital, harming myself and struggling even worse with an eating disorder. That was where some of the healing really started taking place. One of those hospitalizations, I met a young girl, and she shared her story, which was very similar to my story. And so I told her, when you get out, if you need some support or you need some encouragement or something, give me a call. She lived like 6 blocks from us, and she was discharged from the hospital. And when she was, 3 days later, she gave us a call, and her mom was kicking her out. And so she actually came to live with us as a 16-year-old. And she was our very first unofficial foster child. And God was showing me right then and there that he had a plan for my story, and my story could be used to help others. And that was when some of that healing started taking place. My husband knew all of my history. So I had told him everything before we got married. I was very, very selective about who I was sharing my story with. I would share it with people if I saw that it was going to help them. It wasn't really about me sharing it openly with people at that particular stage. Now, later, I became very open. There was a point where the local newspaper asked to do an article about me, about all the work that I was doing with abuse and abused kids. And I said, yes, but I need to use a pseudonym. And so my very first article in the local newspaper, I used a pseudonym, which was fine, except the photographer who told me that our picture on the front would be completely blacked out, shadowed out, put a half-page colored picture of my daughter and I. On the very front page of like section B of this big newspaper is this huge colored picture of my daughter, and she's 5 at the time, under a pseudonym. So it was at that point that I decided that I probably could and should become more open about sharing my story. But it wasn't because I made the decision to. So that was a hard thing. But when I confronted my abusers, so this is actually how that came about. My husband, well, let me back up and show you how good God is. So we became foster parents. After we had that 16-year-old girl move in with us, we decided to become licensed foster parents. I thought, surely I can do better than what I had experienced. And we soon had 9 children living in our home, counting the oldest one who had now aged out that we had gotten from the hospital. She was over the age of 18, but the rest were under the age of 18. And I had this strong feeling, somewhat of a dream, that I didn't want to be in the situation if something happened to my husband, I'd have no way to take care of these kids and be like my mom and not have a degree to help take care of them. So I went to my husband and I said, I feel like the Lord wants me to go to school. And he's like, wait, we have 9 children living here. He's like, this is not the time for you to go to school. And I said, honey, if anything happens to you, I have no way to care for this family. And he's like, honey, I am super healthy. I am young. I am healthy. Nothing's going to happen. We can talk about school later. About 3 days later, I came back to him again. I said, I've been praying about this, and the Lord is adamant. This is the time. And I said, if the Lord wants me to go to school, he's going to allow me to have the ability to do all of the laundry and the cooking and all these other things that need to happen.
How old were you? How old were you?
This was 1991. So I was, 31 years old. So I started Illinois Central College. I started my journey to become a nurse. So I graduated in June of 1993 as a registered nurse. And in August, we find out that my husband has cancer.
Oh, my goodness.
So God is so good, though, that I could see that he was not only preparing me that I would have a way to take care of the kids if that time came or when that time came, but I would also have a profession that I could help him with the chemo and the radiation and the surgeries and the recovery, understanding the medical road that we were now going to be navigating. I look back and God wanted me in school at that particular time for that particular reason. It was through his journey with cancer that my husband would say to me, I think someday you're going to write a book, and the Lord's going to use that book to minister to a lot of people. One day he said, I worry that some of the validity and credibility of your story will die when I die. And this is after he had gone with me to confront my abusers. And so when I'd asked him to go with me to confront my abusers, I said, I want to confront each one of them, and I'd need to fill in some blanks, and I'm not angry. And my husband's like, well, I am.
Yeah.
And I feel like I would want to hurt them.
Yeah.
And I said, I need you there, but I need you to not want to hurt them. He agreed. Not one single abuser denied a single thing that they did.
Wow.
And I largely attribute that to the fact that the Lord had prepared me and I didn't confront out of anger. That was when I found out that I was 3 years old when the abuse started, was through those confrontations. But again, my husband was like, I feel like that some of your story and the credibility of your story will die when I die, and I don't want that to happen. So he had the idea that we would invite our pastor and his wife, our physician and his wife, this Christian psychologist I had been seeing for several years, and a couple of our friends over to our home in our living room. And in the next 2 hours of that meeting, my husband was able to explain what it was like to marry me in those early years and what it was like to see how my life had been impacted by that abuse, and then what it was like to see as I started healing, and then what it was like to see how God was using it, and then what it was like to confront the abusers and even see some restoration done in their lives. And so we had this 2-hour videotape, and God has, when we went to the writing of the book, and I know we're fast forwarding here, that videotape was so helpful in the writing of the book. And in even when my husband died, my husband passed away in 2006. And here I am, a single mom, and I still got 5 kids at home. And the Lord told me again to go to school. So that's when I got my master's degree, my doctorate, and my postdoctorate, working full time, going to school, and as a single mom. And then 3 years later, I meet Craig Nelson. And Craig Nelson finds out that I have 13 children, 10 of which I had taken permanent guardianship through the foster care system and 3 biological. And he put both hands up in the air and said, I am not dating any woman with 13 children. It is not happening. And he was that adamant and that strong about it. And so, but he kept showing up. And I'm like, what's going on here? So we were dating about 3 weeks. And I came to him and I said, we need to do a movie night at your house. And so it was that night that I made him watch that video that my first husband had made.
Had you showed that video to anybody else over the years?
Not a single person at that point.
Wow.
God used that as an instrument for me to help him understand that I came with a huge backstory, and there was a reason that I migrated towards helping children who had been abused, and there was a reason that I did foster care. He said the video was overwhelming.
I bet.
He said it was very hard to watch, and at that point, he just kind of, in his own way, how he dealt with it was after the video was over, I said, tell me what you're thinking. He says, I think it's time to go to Cracker Barrel. And so we went to Cracker Barrel. And again, he came from a background that sexual abuse wasn't something that was talked about. It wasn't something that was discussed. And so those first few years of being married to Craig, it was very hard for him to hear me talking about it. And now he's one of my biggest proponents and one of my biggest people that are saying, oh my goodness, you have to hear her story. God is using it in mighty ways. And so, yeah.
Wow. One of the things you said that I want to just flesh out a little bit, you said the Lord had prepared you not to confront in anger. What did that preparation look like? Because I think there are probably some people listening, their abuse may be decades ago, but they cannot imagine not being stuck in that place of anger.
Right. Well, I think how the Lord prepared me was back in those days, I was doing a lot of reading and self-help books. I was also testifying as an expert in child sexual abuse for Peoria County State's Attorney's Office, and had worked on a suicide hotline and worked on a rape crisis line. And I had so much knowledge about those, especially men. And so I want to clarify this in a way that everyone understands it. Not every man that was abused abuses. However, almost every man that abuses was abused. And so when you start looking at those people from the lens of their life, and that the Lord still loves them, and that they're replicating what was done to them as a child, I think the Lord gives you more empathy and more sympathy and a more of an understanding of wounded people wound people. And they were wounded. They came from the same fragmented, messed up life I did, the same fragmented, messed up family line that I did. And so whether it's generational curses or whether it's just environmental, that this, they had the same grandfathers and the same uncles that I did, the Lord just gave me the ability to say, what is it I want out of this? I want to know if my memories were accurate. I want them to fill in a few of the gaps that I had. I didn't really have a lot of gaps, but I had a few. And I wanted them to know that I wasn't mad. And I wanted to share with them about the Lord. And the fun thing was, the very first person that we confronted, hadn't heard from him in years. His mom had been married to my uncle, and he was older. And when his mom divorced my uncle, they left the family. And so I never heard from him. But I tracked him down because he was one of my abusers. And in my mind, he was probably 19 or 20, and I was 3. But when I actually confronted him, I found out he was 16. So I had him older in my head, but it was a cold call. I gotten his phone number from somebody, and it was a cold call. My husband and I are both on the phone. He answers the phone, and he immediately says, when I told him who I was, he goes, I know exactly what you're calling for, and I can't talk to you right now, but I will call you right back after I tell my wife everything.
Oh my goodness.
And I thought, he's not going to call back, right? That's what you first think. He's hung up and he's done. Probably 15 minutes later, he and his wife called back, and he starts with this, and I haven't even told him I'm a Christian yet. He says, Phyllis, you need to know that I'm a born-again Christian, and I'm married, and I have a 3-year-old daughter, and every time I look at her, I think about what I did to you. And I have never told my wife until just now, and she's on the phone too. So I will hear, and we will hear whatever it is you want to say. That was my first person that I confronted. So the Lord had prepared me in such an amazing way for my first confrontation. And I'm like, I'm not mad at you. I don't hate you. I need to know, what was your life growing up like? And what made you think, did I do something that made you think you could abuse me and that I wouldn't tell? And so answering some of those questions for me were so helpful. But the first one, wanting to make sure that I knew he was a born-again Christian and that he just then confessed to his wife what he had done as a 16-year-old child, helped me confront the others.
Wow. One of the things that you said as you were just describing that is that, wounded people wound people, and you were wounded, and yet you didn't become a wounder in that same way. And I'd love for you just to talk about what are the things that you feel like made that difference for you.
Sure. Well, first of all, statistically, women that are abused don't as frequently become abusers. Unfortunately, girls that are abused are 4 times more likely to be abused all the way into adulthood than boys. And so that was my story. I just kept getting abused. And so I knew all of the heart-wrenching pain that came from my abuse. And so all I wanted to do was help people. I turned to, I want to volunteer on the suicide hotline. I want to be working for the Rape Crisis Center here in Peoria. I actually got a job for the Better Safe Than Sorry program, going to all the school districts, teaching young children about their body and how to keep it safe. And so I did the opposite. I wanted to be the one that brought healing. Now, does that mean I didn't wound people along the way? Oh my gosh, I'm sure I wounded my husband many times out of fear. I remember not letting him be alone with my newborn baby for probably 2 years because I was so afraid. So I wounded people, but not in a sexual sense and not ever on purpose. But my own wounds, I'm sure, created wounds in others.
Today, if you're talking with someone who's had a history similar to yours, but who is in that place of anger or is maybe even has given up on God because of what they've experienced, how do you offer hope to someone?
Well, one of the things I tell them is that they need to get into a good Christian counselor. For me, I needed to find 1 or 2 good Christian friends that were safe and that I could talk to. But more than anything, I think the thing that started my journey to healing was using my story to help bring healing to others. So when people are so angry and so frustrated and they can't make sense of something, find an organization to volunteer and help. Go work with the homeless. Go work with a foster care system. Go become a CASA worker. There's so many opportunities out there where you can see that you're not the only wounded person in the world. And the more you help others through their wounds, God just starts healing you from yours. And so that's one of the recommendations. And don't beat yourself up over the fact that you might be angry at the church. God is big enough to hear that you're angry at the church. But at the same time, you might be angry at a restaurant that you went to once because they had poor service. It doesn't mean you're not going to ever go to another restaurant, right? That may not be the church for you, but it doesn't mean that you need to give up on all churches. There's a lot of healthy people in the church if you will look for them.
Tell me more about fostering kids. You fostered a lot of kids over the years.
Over 100.
Over
yes.
100. That's driven by obviously a passion that you'd had. When you started with the 16-year-old, I'm sure you had no idea. Can you talk about just the progression of that and
Sure.
how that worked out?
I started seeing where having her and sharing my story with her was healing. So I decided at that point that, maybe we could be foster parents. And my husband, again, was at first like a little bit skittish about it. And interestingly enough, to become a foster parent, you have to get a physical from your physician, right? And this is where I will tell you something I probably did that I shouldn't have done. But I went to my physician and he's like, Phyllis, do you know how many psychiatric hospitalizations you've had in the last 10 years? You shouldn't do this. You absolutely shouldn't do this. And I said, okay. So I went to the phone book and I found another physician that's never seen me before. And he signed my physical. And so now that original physician has come back to me and written me letters saying, oh my gosh, you have done amazing and this is great. And I really see how the Lord has used you. But, he was absolutely not going to sign it. So becoming a foster parent helped bring so much healing in my life and helped me see that the journey that the Lord had me on. And that's not to say that the Lord causes these things to happen to us. So
right.
I want to make sure that I clarify that because, some of the things that happen in our lives are a result of our own sin. Some of the things that happen in our lives are a result of other people's sins. And some of the things happen in our lives that we may never understand on this earth. God says, whether it's in that category or this category or this category, if you will lay it all at the cross, I will use it for good. Whether it's because of your own sin, the sin of somebody else, or something you don't understand. And that's what the Lord was showing me. For me, becoming that foster parent and trying to help these other kids see that there are other, because the first thing a foster child says is, you don't understand. Oftentimes I would just throw them 2 or 3 newspaper articles about me and say, read this, come back to me and tell me what I don't understand. And so having that credibility of having walked somewhat in their shoes, although every story is different, I think was helpful to them. That's why I encourage other people to find an organization that you can go serve in, because sometimes it's through serving others that the Lord starts healing us.
How did you not get angry at God? What do you see as maybe it's the practical stuff, but how did you not get angry at God at what had happened to you? And then all that you were exposed to through the foster kids, you had to hear of horrible things over and over and over again. How does that not begin to build up a callousness? Why do you think that didn't happen for you?
I wish I could tell you what I knew 100% that this is why it didn't happen to me, but there's several possible answers to that. One was, I remember as a young child feeling like I had no one but God. And so when you're at a point where there's no one but God, that's the last person that you want to give up on. I remember thinking, I don't have anyone else. There's nothing else I can depend on that's been solid. I've been always able to separate people's behavior, including pastors or deacons or whatever, from God, and sin of other people and choices of other people from God. Maybe that was just a gift the Lord gave me, that I could see that, or that would be really important to me. But I never got angry about my abuse, not towards God. I got angry about my abuse, but not towards God. I felt like somehow, somewhere along the line, he was going to show me how he could use it. I had no idea what that was going to look like, but I was taking steps every day and going through doors every day to let him use it by saying, I want to seek out the suicide hotline. I work there. I want to do this. I want to do this. I was finding organizations where my knowledge and my experiences could be used, because I really felt like God wanted to use them, but I just wasn't sure how. And now everything in my life has come as a direct result of my trauma, my abuse, and my losses. My husband died in 2006. I lost my youngest son, biological son, to cancer in 2021. But I see now that the Lord is allowing me to witness to people who have lost a spouse, people who have lost a loved one to suicide, people who have lost a child to cancer. I've done over 40 international mission trips all over the world, telling people that trauma and abuse do not have to define them, and that there is a Savior named Jesus Christ that loves them and wants a relationship with them. I have served as an expert in child sexual abuse. I serve on the board of directors for CASA, which is an organization that gives a voice to children in foster care. My daughter, we just celebrated last night. My daughter just adopted her 4th child through the foster care system. So she has become a foster parent now and adopted her 4th child this week. So God has used every single trauma in my life for good. It doesn't mean it wasn't painful. It doesn't mean it's not still painful on days, but God is using it for good. And for that, I feel blessed.
I always like to talk about, like, when you think about your faith, your understanding of God as a young child and where you are today, what do you see as key differences? And one of the things you described as a child was that performance mentality.
100%.
Yeah. And now as you're talking, you sound like a woman who is so utterly convinced of God's love for you that not even the worst trauma that the world can throw at you can diminish that understanding of his love. Right. That's pretty radical. So what do you attribute that to?
Yeah. So honestly, I would say that continues on every single day. But I mean, it was years ago, many years ago, and I can't tell you an exact event, but when I would look at something bad that happened and I would see how God would use it, and I would look at how something bad that would happen and see how God prepared me for it and then would use it, you learn to start trusting God. You don't trust the world. You don't trust circumstances. You don't trust emotions. But I started trusting God because I saw He had me on a path that He was carefully navigating so that I would be as best prepared as I could be to handle the next trauma that was happening. And all of us, I mean, we've seen what a crazy week we've had here, but all of us experience trauma. All of us experience disappointment and challenges and frustrations and all these things that we can never put into this beautiful little box. But if we will look for it, we will see signs that God prepared us along the way, and that God continues to minister to us, and that God continues to use it. And if we see those markings and we see those stones of remembrances, as the Old Testament would tell us about, then our development of that trust for God as our eternal loving Father who wants our best grows.
Phillis wants you to know this. Trauma and abuse don't have to define you. Jesus loves you, and He can take even the deepest pain and turn it into passion and purpose. She says it wasn't really the things that happened to her that brought so much shame and fear. It was the secrecy. Once she allowed God's light to shine in those dark places, the shame lost its power. What the enemy meant for evil, God is now using for good. Phillis says your past cannot stop the future that God has for you. He can use your story to bring hope and healing to others. If you want to learn more, Phillis wrote a book about her journey. It's called I'm Still Standing, How God Turned My Pain into Purpose. And you can find that on Amazon. She's also got resources on her website, phyllisdewitt.com, along with a way to reach out if you would like her to speak at your event. You'll find the link to her book and her website in the show notes. Huge thanks to Phillis for sharing her story. And thanks to our team, Michael Shermack, and our producer and network director, Jason Rackow, and to you for listening. If this episode encouraged you, would you hit subscribe, leave a kind review, or share it with a friend who might need some hope today? And if you'd like to support inspiring shows like this one, you'll find a link to give in the show notes. The Unfolding is a production of Faith Podcasts. Find more great shows at myfaithpodcast.com. We'll be back next week with another page of The Unfolding.